Calls himself a government outsider, a populist, taking on the Republican establishment in Kentucky's U.S. Senate race. Good evening. From WYMT Mountain News, I'm Neil Middleton. Thanks for joining us tonight, and for those watching on the web, thanks for logging on to WYMTnews.com. Kentucky's U.S. Senate race is gaining national attention. Lieutenant Governor Daniel Mangiardo and Attorney General Jack Conway are battling it out in the Democratic primary. And the Republicans have an interesting race shaping up as well, with three candidates vying to hold on to incumbent Jim Bunning's Senate seat. Secretary of State Trey Grayson is the front runner and enjoys the backing of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell and the National Republican Senatorial Committee. Grayson faces Western Kentucky businessman Bill Johnson and Bowling Green ophthalmologist Rand Paul in the May primary. During the next few weeks, we will talk to each of the candidates about their stance on the issues ranging from health care to the economy to the campaign ahead. We begin tonight with Rand Paul. We'll hear where he stands on the issues of health care reform, the economy, taxes, coal, and national defense. Plus, we'll take some of your questions live via email, Twitter, and text messaging. You see the information there on your screen. You can send me an email or you can send a text message to 5757 from your Appalachian wireless phone. We will get to as many of your questions as possible tonight. That's all coming up on Issues and Answers, the Mountain Edition.
Issues and Answers, the Mountain Edition, is sponsored by Hazard Mayor Bill Gorman and the City Commissioners. Come home to the mountains.
Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here tonight, sir.
Good to be with you, Neil.
You know, most people probably know you best as the son of the 2008 presidential candidate, Texas Congressman Ron Paul. So tell us, who is Rand Paul?
Well, I'm an eye surgeon from Bowling Green. I've been practicing there for about 18 years. My wife grew up in a little town, Russellville, about 30 miles away from there, and that's where her family is. And you know how when you get married, you decide where you're going, and we decided to come to Kentucky, and we've loved every minute of it. All of our three kids have been raised here. In addition to medicine, I also am involved with a nonprofit group called the Southern Kentucky Lions Eye Clinic. We provide health care for some of those who can't afford health care. Politically, I've been mostly involved with a group called the Kentucky Taxpayers United, and we do two main things. We ask candidates and people in office to take a pledge saying they will not vote to raise taxes, and we also have rated the state legislature on how your legislator votes on tax and spending issues, and we've done that for about 15 years. I think it's important because a lot of times we send these guys to Frankfurt or women to Frankfurt. In Washington, nobody knows how they vote, so we would publish a rating each year and let you know specifically on contentious issues, how did your legislator vote. So that's what I spent a lot of the last many years doing, is both practicing medicine, coaching baseball, coaching soccer, bringing up my kids, and then also working with this taxpayer group.
Some have questioned whether you would be even running for the U.S. Senate if it were not for your dad.
I don't run away from that fact. I think we live in an era of celebrity, and having celebrity helps you run for office. We have Arnold Schwarzenegger in California. We've had a series of Kennedys. We've had a series of Bushes. It doesn't win you in office, but it certainly opens a lot of doors. I can't win on my father's name. I have to win on my own merits, and I think I can present and articulate the message of limited government and freedom in a way that will grow our movement enough to win an election. But, yeah, I don't run away from the fact that my dad's famous, and it has helped me. It's opened a lot of doors. I mean, we've probably had 15 national interviews, 50 national radio interviews. We get a lot of doors that open for us. But I think that's a good thing. If you're doing something that you think will help the country, rather than doing it for my own personal gratification, I don't need the job. I've got a good job. I'm running for office not because I want fame or fortune. I'm running for office because I'm seriously worried about the deficit. I'm worried about how large government grows, and I think you have to stand up as citizens and do something.
What makes you qualified? This is first venture into politics, right?
Right.
What would you say would make you qualified to serve as a U.S. Senator, especially when you consider that the experience that Jim Bunning brought to the job serving both the House and the Senate?
Right. I think people are ready for an outsider. I think my biggest attribute is that I have not held public office before. You look at this Tea Party movement, there's discontent in our country. There's an uneasiness about what's going on in Washington. People are tired of the career politicians. They're tired of people whose first impulse is to vote in a way to stay in office. Whereas my first impulse is, our country has a massive deficit. We have to balance our budget. We have to have term limits. We have to reform our government. We can't have a Congress who votes on 1,100-page bills and no one reads them. People are unhappy about what they're getting from the career politicians. I think it's the best year in a generation for an outsider to run. I think you want someone who's intelligent, someone who can articulate the message, but I don't think you necessarily want someone who spent their whole life in government service, whereas I spent my whole life as a small businessman and in medicine. And I think we want one of us, not some sort of super class out there that knows something the rest of us don't know. I think there's a lot of common sense that comes from regular folks in Kentucky that somehow you're not smarter if you're in Washington than you are if you're here. In fact, I think they're misguided often by sort of losing Kentucky common sense by being in Washington too long.
So I noticed on your website, and you said it here, you're in favor of term limits. What should those limits be, and will you work for that if you're elected while you're in office or after you're?
Absolutely. I think senators should serve no more than 2 6-year terms, and in the House, 6 2-year terms. It's 12 in the House and 12 in the Senate. I will introduce it as the first piece of legislation. If I'm elected, the first bill that I will introduce will be a constitutional amendment to limit terms. People say, oh, you can't win, there won't be enough votes. I guess what? I'm going to be very loud and vocal about it, and if there's not enough votes now, we're going to grow the Republican Party by being a party that is for reform and does what we say and votes that way. And I think there's something to be said for being vocal for things you believe in. Look what happened after FDR. A groundswell happened, and boom, they limited the president. It's harder because it was Congress limiting the president, and a lot of congressmen want to be president. It's harder now. You're having congressmen try to limit themselves. So it's an uphill battle, but I will fight that battle. The second piece of legislation I'll introduce is a balanced budget amendment, because you want them to come home with term limits, but even if they stay up there, you cannot trust them to do the right thing. They succumb to the power and the trappings of office, and they won't do it. In Kentucky, we have to do it. We have a balanced budget amendment in Kentucky, and by law, we balance our budget. Republicans and Democrats disagree on how it's going to be spent, but in the final analysis, we have to balance our budget. It's the only thing that will ever work in Washington is a rule that they cannot escape.
What would you say the difference is between you and your two opponents?
I think really between myself and Grayson is that he's a career politician. I think he spent many years really trying to avoid take stands on issues, and I've spent many years trying to articulate the issues. Good examples to look at our websites. We've got 26, 28 issues on our website. There's not an issue on his. I think that we truly believe in things. For example, I've been speaking out against the bank bailout. I think he's coming around. I hear my speeches somewhat resonating in his new speeches, but I'm not afraid to talk about that because, many Republicans voted for the bank bailout, and I tell them, look, it's a Republican primary. This is a time to decide, do you want leadership who oppose the bank bailouts, or do you want someone who's now sort of a Johnny-come-lately, knows it's a popular issue and say, well, yeah, I would have been. Had I said anything, I would have been against the TARP plan.
So what would you have said? If you were elected, you would have voted against the bailout. What about the people that said, if we don't do something now, the economy is going to crash and we're going to have the worst depression since the Great Depression?
These were the same people who didn't predict the housing bubble and who all told us, Timothy Geithner, Bernanke, all told us in 2006 everything was fine. And they were doing all the right thing by making interest rates 0%. So the same people who told us these companies were too big to fail were the same people who didn't predict the crisis. And so what did we do? We reappointed them all to high office even though they had failed us in getting us into this problem. So I would say to listen to them is a mistake. When people tell you a company's too big to fail, I respond by, I think they're too big to bail out. AIG should have gone through organized bankruptcy. So should have Chrysler and GM. We bailed them all out, and they're still going bankrupt. So we gave billions of dollars to the car industry, which was just like throwing it down a rat hole, because they still went bankrupt. And we're getting none of that money back.